You were taught that economic sanctions are a tool of diplomacy, a lever pulled when military force is off the table. But here's what they don't mention. Every sanction the United States has imposed since 1950 has quietly rewritten the rules of who gets to hold power in the global economy. Not through conquest, not through negotiation, through exclusion. Once you see what really went down, trust me, you can't unsee it. Welcome to the wealth timeline, where money, power, and history quietly shape the world around us. Because what began as a Cold War tactic has become the most consequential financial weapon ever deployed. And it's now threatening the very architecture that made it possible. By 1945, the United States controlled more than half of global manufacturing output. The dollar was anchored to gold. Bretton Woods had just established a new monetary order, and Washington held the keys to the world's reserve currency. For the first time in history, financial access became a form of geopolitical leverage. You didn't need to invade. You didn't need treaties. You just needed to decide who could use the system and who couldn't. At the time, this seemed like progress, a civilized alternative to war. What no one noticed was the cost. The modern sanctions regime didn't begin with Russia or Iran. It began in 1950, when President Harry Truman signed the Trading with the Enemy Act into something far broader, a framework for economic containment. The logic was simple. The Soviet Union and its allies operated outside the dollar system. Sanctions would isolate them further, pressure their economies, and prevent the spread of communism without firing a shot. And it worked, partially. Throughout the Cold War, the United States deployed targeted embargoes against Cuba, North Korea, and Soviet satellite states. These weren't global disruptions. They were surgical cuts designed to weaken adversaries while keeping allies close. The assumption was this: as long as America remained the center of global trade and finance, exclusion from that system was a fate no country could afford. It worked, but only under conditions that would not last. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, something unexpected happened. Sanctions didn't fade, they expanded. Between 1990 and 2000, the United States imposed more sanctions than it had in the previous 4 decades combined. Iraq, Serbia, Libya, Sudan, Myanmar. The justification shifted from ideology to behavior: human rights violations, nuclear proliferation, support for terrorism, and the mechanism evolved. In 1995, President Bill Clinton signed Executive Order 947, introducing a new tool: targeted financial sanctions. These weren't trade embargoes. They were asset freezes that cut individuals and entities off from the global banking system. Then came September 11th, 2001. The Patriot Act gave the Treasury Department sweeping authority to designate terrorists and freeze assets without trial. Suddenly, the dollar system wasn't just a trade network. It was a surveillance grid. By 2010, the infrastructure was complete. SWIFT, the messaging system used by nearly every international bank, could be weaponized with a single executive order. When the United States sanctioned Iran's central bank in 2012, it didn't just hurt Iran. It forced every bank in the world to choose: access to Tehran or access to New York. Most chose New York. The stronger it became, the harder it was to stop. But weapons don't only hurt their targets. In 2014, after Russia annexed Crimea, the United States and European Union froze Russian state assets and banned major banks from accessing Western capital markets. Russia didn't collapse. Instead, it began building alternatives. Moscow accelerated its de-dollarization strategy, increasing gold reserves, settling trade in yuan and rubles, and developing its own interbank messaging system to bypass SWIFT. Then, in 2018, the United States withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions, not just on Iran, but on any company doing business with Iran. This included European firms. For the first time, America's closest allies were being forced to comply with sanctions they hadn't agreed to, or lose access to the dollar system. Germany, France, and the United Kingdom responded by creating Instex, a barter mechanism designed to circumvent U.S. financial oversight. It barely functioned, but the message was clear. Even allies were beginning to see the dollar's dominance as a liability. Nothing collapsed, and that was the problem. On February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Within days, the United States, European Union, and allied nations froze over $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. Let that settle. $300 billion, sovereign wealth held in foreign accounts, rendered inaccessible overnight. It was the most aggressive financial intervention in modern history, and it worked in the short term. The ruble plunged, capital fled. Russia's economy contracted sharply, but the second-order effects were immediate. China, Saudi Arabia, India, Brazil, countries holding trillions in dollar-denominated reserves, watched carefully. If the United States could freeze a G20 nation's central bank assets during wartime, what stopped it from doing the same during a trade dispute, a diplomatic conflict, a domestic political crisis? The answer, nothing. For decades, the implicit deal was this: hold dollars and your wealth is safe. That guarantee evaporated in February 2022. From this point on, the outcome was no longer optional. By 2023, the patterns were undeniable. Saudi Arabia began settling oil sales in yuan. The UAE expanded its non-dollar trade corridors. China and Brazil established a direct currency swap, bypassing the dollar entirely for bilateral trade. Even France's President Emmanuel Macron publicly warned against the extraterritoriality of U.S. sanctions, calling for European financial independence. This wasn't rebellion, it was diversification. Central banks quietly reduced their dollar reserve holdings. In 2022, the dollar's share of global reserves fell to its lowest level in 25 years, still dominant at 58%, but declining for the first time in a generation. Meanwhile, cross-border payment systems proliferated. China's CIPs, Russia's SPFS, India's integration with Asian clearing unions. None could rival SWIFT's scale, but they didn't need to. They just needed to offer an alternative. Who benefited? Countries with independent payment infrastructure, nations with commodity leverage, economies less dependent on Western capital markets. Who absorbed the cost? The very system sanctions were designed to protect. Because the power of exclusion depends on one condition: that there is nowhere else to go, and that condition no longer holds. This isn't a story about the end of American power. It's a story about the cost of using it. Sanctions remain effective in specific contexts, against smaller economies, non-state actors, isolated regimes, but their overuse has created a paradox. The more frequently the United States weaponizes the dollar, the more incentive other nations have to build systems that don't depend on it. History doesn't repeat events, it repeats incentives. And right now, the incentive structure is clear: reduce dollar exposure, build parallel infrastructure, and hedge against financial exclusion. The irony is that sanctions were designed to preserve American influence without military force, but influence only works when people believe there's no alternative. 2 takeaways. First, no system is permanent. The dollar's dominance wasn't inevitable, and its decline won't be either, but every tool has a breaking point, and overuse accelerates it. Second, power doesn't collapse, it migrates. But weapons don't only hurt their targets. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden chapter of history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the Wealth Timeline, and turn on the bell icon, because the next story might just change how you see power itself.